The podcast which you are about to hear is an account of rewatching a horror classic which befell a group of two adults, in particular Lauren Tocci and her husband Ryan. It is all the more tragic in that they were restricted on time, but had they talked a very, very long time about it, they could not have expected to convey, nor could they have wished to talk as much of the mad and macabre beauty as they were to converse about that day. For them, an idyllic summer film at a drive-in or a theater is one that can be a nightmare. The contents of this show this day were to lead to the discussion of one of the most bizarre films in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Starts here. Welcome to the How Could You podcast. I'm Lauren Tocci.
And look at me, I'm Leatherface!
I'm out. I'm sorry for my roaring laughter, but if you know that deep cut reference to Devon Sawa's Idle Hands, then one, don't watch that movie. It's probably terrible. But two, that line always makes me laugh.
That's why I did it. I like your laugh. And I figured with this, lighthearted film we're going to discuss today, why don't we get the jokes going?
Dude, this movie's dark.
It is.
It's super bleak.
Well, but also very, bright.
Yes, sun-bleached.
Yeah.
But really dark in tone and thematic value.
This is going to be a fun one in a weird way because there's a lot to talk about.
Well, the production history for sure. But before we get to that, if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We are a couple that met at a movie theater, fell in love, and never really quite left. We started this podcast to explore gaps in our film knowledge, and it's evolving into us just talking about kind of great film debates. If you tuned in last week, you may have caught us debating about Fast Times at Ridgemont High versus Dazed and Confused, which I think ended in it
was almost a draw, I think.
It was a draw,
if it leaned anyway, maybe a little Fast Times, but I would say it was very close, and I would say most people, very little did we get somebody that didn't like one or the other.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's just a lot of love for both movies, and I don't think anyone really rampantly said to us they dislike one of the films.
No.
Yeah. So we started doing something in season 2, which we called Tossi's Takes, because we just wanted to share about some of the contemporary things that we were seeing, but probably wouldn't cover on the show. So Ryan, do you have a Tossi's Takes for this week?
Yeah, we didn't do it last week because we had an entire summer and it would have been a lot. I have two very quick ones, a film and a TV show.
Ooh.
So my film, which if anybody saw my personal Instagram account knows I raved about, which is the Nicolas Cage movie Pig. And I just have to say, you have to see it. And I would tell you to just go in and not know anything about it, but I think people need to know something about it. And what I'm going to say is this movie, it's not a horror movie. It's not a John Wick-style action movie. It's not some gross-out movie. It is honestly a really heartfelt drama movie with a lot of real, it's about love, really, honestly, and about loss, and Nicolas Cage just gives an excellent performance. The whole cast is really good. It's really understated. I cannot recommend it enough. And then I think you really liked it too, right?
Oh my gosh, I loved it. I didn't want to, because I just was nodding because I completely agree with you. It's not what I expected at all. When you told me we were watching it, I was picturing something like Mandy.
Yeah.
Or like John Wick, something much more psychedelic. It's very, I don't know, it's a very hard film to explain, but I would say it's everything you just said it was, and it's a really interesting path that it takes. I find it to be one of the more unexpected films we've seen this year.
And I think it's the type of movie that when people see it, everybody's gonna come out going, "Wow, did not expect that," and it was how good it was. So
really good performances, too.
Very good performances, and then it was one of the things I think I said to you. Reminding me that Nicolas Cage is a Oscar-winning actor.
Yeah,
and you can see that in this performance. The other one, really quick, is there are only 3 episodes in, but FXX, Why the Last Man. Really recommend the graphic novel, Brian K. Vaughan and Pia Guerrera, but the show has done a great job in its first 3 episodes, so highly recommend it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I'm going to add something to this with this. Mm-hmm. I feel like you have been anticipating this since the early 2000s. Someone's got to make Why the Last Man. You're the first person I ever knew that talked about that graphic novel.
Well, our friend Joe introduced it to me. He gave it to me as a birthday or Christmas present one year, and I was hooked from the go from it. So, and I've been bothering you about it for years and been hoping for either a film or a great miniseries. So we'll see what they do with a series. Sometimes TV shows can, start to stretch out a little thin. So we'll see what happens, but they're off to an awesome start.
And Yorick. Trust me.
Yorick.
Awesome. Yorick. Yes. He's awesome.
Agent 355. You're going to love him.
Agent 355 rules. Those are great Tossi's takes, and I agree with you. I think if we had tried to do it last episode, there would have been just so much to cover from like what we had done this summer and what we had seen. Yeah. My Tossi's takes are also twofold, but mine is more of a take from our last episode and then a film. Oh, man. And it pains me to admit this, but in the editing process and having to re-listen to our audio and just kind of checking things, I had to re-listen to our argument. And, oh, man, damn, did you win that argument? And I did not want to admit it during the episode. But I was re-listening to it. I was like, oh, he makes really good points about fast times. And I think it really in the story categories where it stood out to me, and I just had to say that because I was listening, I was like, he's really right about that story. It's so much better constructed, and it did things. And I think, honestly, we could have recorded another hour just talking about how landmark what Amy Heckerling did in terms of like how she directed that story and what she did with the character of Stacey. So that's my first Tossi's take.
I like that Tossi's take.
I believe that you do.
I will say probably our biggest mistake, not just doing a single episode for each of those films.
We really should have.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I think, honestly, because they probably could have both had almost like the same length if we did them separately, but that's fair. But it was fun. It was still fun to debate, but it pains me to admit, but you definitely won that one.
I don't know if I won it, but I appreciate
it was a strong
giving me a little more
argument.
Credit there.
I did speech and debate in high school. You won the argument.
I quit debate.
We can talk about that too, right? My film recommendation is, without a doubt, and please see it and bring on this next phase of Marvel, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings.
Oh, yeah, good call.
Oof, man. I felt so amped after that movie. I just wanted to like scream it from the rooftops. And I get where anyone who is kind of worried about the next phase of Marvel is like, oh no, I have Marvel fatigue. The TV shows, I think, have been sucking us in. And I think the worry about the next phase is you had this incredible thing that you were building towards, and then it happened. And there's the fruition of so many stories and so many characters, and then so many characters that are kind of lost and are not coming back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But this made a very important case study in going, this is the guy who should be leading the MCU in the next phase. It was incredible. It mixed its humor and balanced it out really nicely. Awkwafina rules in this movie. It's just incredible. The fight sequences, the bus sequence is just incredible. And then additionally, it's a really, the way it's shot is you can really see all of the choreography in the fight sequences. That's not always how action movies are shot. Sometimes they're done very quickly, so you can't really see the action that's happening. It's shot brilliantly. It's beautiful. It'll kind of make you a little emotional at the end. It'll hit you in the feels a little bit.
That's the biggest thing I was going to say about it was I don't normally find myself, I really love the Marvel films. I don't always find myself emotional. I found this one to be more emotional than I expected. Now, time of year for anybody that knows for us, but also there was something that hit with this one a little bit more, and that's a real credit to it. And I won't lie, I was one of those people you're talking about. I know you were really ready for the next phase. I was ready for a break from the Marvel, but this one got me real excited and back in it. So bring on the Eternals. I'm pumped.
Yeah. We got a Spider-Man movie coming. We got Doctor Strange in the Multiverse. There just feels like really cool things ahead. But honestly, I just want another Shang-Chi story.
Shang-Chi leading the way, the new, quote unquote Cap with him and Anthony Mackie, leading the charge. I am 100% behind.
100% give me a movie where Captain America and Shang-Chi, because I do think those team-ups are going to happen, and I think they're going to be awesome and epic and give me a whole another 10 years of Marvel films. So those are our Tossi's takes for this week. Check those things out. Support your local movie theaters or stream it. Do whatever you do. Whatever's convenient for you.
Movie theaters.
All right, yes.
Theaters.
Yes, movie theaters. But whatever is also convenient, just make sure you're checking some of this stuff out. So on to our film of the day, which is...
Hey, I got a serious question for you, though.
Yes.
Is Saturn in retrograde right now?
Honestly, if Saturn is, I'm worried.
Yeah, everybody's worried if it is.
So we'll start by talking about astrology, I guess, to get into this film. Obviously you can see from the title, we are going to be diving into Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, quote-unquote, one of those based on a true story horror films. And there's a lot to talk about with this film, but I thought given that kind of opens this portion of it, and you did the wonderful narration at the beginning of our episode today, based on true story horror films, what are your takes on them? Do you have any that you like? Do you think it's effective? Do you think it's too played out? Does it work for this film?
I can't stand it.
Ooh, okay.
And here's the thing. I'm going to, be a hypocrite right off the bat and say I love it for this movie.
Yes.
Especially once I knew why. There is actually very specific reason why they pushed it for that aspect of being based on a true story, or that feel or that want from it.
Would you like to share with the class?
We're getting right into the heavy stuff, right? Essentially, Tobe Hooper wanted people to... He essentially wanted to have it feel like it was based on a true story, because at the time, his feeling, and we'll get a lot into this, because this movie has a lot of inroads on how it gets there and what kind of helped make it. But one of the big things is the back end of the Vietnam War, and Tobe Hooper's kind of feeling on the we were being lied to, the everything, and how there was one face, and yet there was something really, more behind it. And that was kind of his reasoning with it. He wanted the audience at that time to feel like, no, I am pulling the rug out of you. I am lying to you. This is not based on a true story, not fully anyway, and I want you to be lied to, because that's what's happening every day on the television, that's what's happening every day through the government, and that's kind of, and not to get to, it's not trying to be this whole big political thing here, it's just saying that is what his purpose behind that marketing. I'm sure there's a little bit of, it gave it a lot mystique too, but that was the purpose behind it.
Well, and the interesting thing about this, so there's a really wonderful book, if you're a horror fan, it's called Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. It's written by Joseph Maddrey, and he does a really great chapter on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Interestingly enough, and just because it's been a long time since I had opened that book, I didn't remember that was Tobe Hooper's intentions, but Joseph Maddrey really evaluates this as being a film that is... either not a symptom, I would say more of an effect of the Vietnam War, of showing particularly kind of like the gore and the horror that is ever present, and I think it's particular how, certainly how these characters are dressed and kind of the, archetypes that they can kind of fill in like a horror movie, and like how they function, and the fact that you have like, the one girl was talking about like astrology and like kind of showing like the counterculture movement of the time, then bucked up against this like intense violence and kind of like some little things thrown in about like the slaughterhouse like shutting down, and like all these like things, these kind of American horrors that are, for the first time, like ever present in our home. Well, what if that was, instead of being this conflict that's, a world, half a world away, what if all of a sudden this was now someone in your town? Because, and looking at like kind of the construct of monsters in that way, and how, horror really is reflective of the times it exists in, the 1930s and the Depression and the universal monsters that come out of that. I highly recommend, if you're interested in any of this, check out that book. I think it's a really helpful like way to kind of see those through lines, but 100%, I'm not surprised that this was Tobe Hooper's intentions. It does make the grit of the film feel weightier, I would say.
Yeah, he wanted it to be intentional misinformation, because that's what he thought was happening. We also have to remember, and you have to keep this in mind in the backdrop of this film, is this is right during Watergate. So that's going on as well. So there's just a lot what he felt was a lot of misinformation coming out to the American people, and that was that was the intent, and showing, and this is a little bit played out, but the real monster is man type of feeling, so I think that, and that's the other intention here.
But unfortunately, and I'll counter that, I'll say it's not necessarily played out. I think horror just expresses that because it unfortunately keeps happening. You look at the Romero zombie films, you look at those and how those respond to the cultural times in which they exist, and looking at what happens if now we're the enemy, and that's the representation of the zombie. But I think it's something that you're right, Tobe Hooper does really effectively, and I think a lot of, and I'm sure we'll get into this conversation later, a lot of horror films kind of owe, their their success and their stylings to this film, but I think that's something that Tobe Hooper really kind of zeroes in on. We have these anxieties, we have these fears, and he manifests them in a small Texas town, but these are all things people feel uncertain, they feel like they can't trust authority figures, which I think comes to fruition really nicely a little bit later on in the film, kind of with Sally not realizing kind of the trap she's walked into.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that works all really effectively. So I'll ask, because you said you hate them, so do you find it just too gimmicky, based on a true story?
It's so gimmicky at this point, and once you start doing any type of research, and obviously most people, I don't know how much anybody really buys 100% into it when it's in a horror film these days. There's such a thin line. I mean, the Conjuring series, which we're fans of, we like the universe of the Conjuring, but they're riding on that completely, and it's so, especially this last one, so thin on any type of reality or truth.
Do you know, I had no issue with the based on a true story for every other film prior to this last one.
I gotcha.
The Devil Made Me Do It really bothered me because I was but none of that happened. None of that happened, and that case is really famous because of that line. And I don't feel dissimilar to you. I like things that feel realistic. Obviously, I'm a massive fan of the Blair Witch Project and kind of the trick of that. I love found footage films. I don't mind when something says it's based on a true story, but I think the problem is the burden that comes with that is then on the audience member to do their research to see if it was actually based. And I think in horror films, you have something like The Exorcism of Emily Rose. No, that's not how it happened. That's not what happened. Not that, and certainly I'm not trying to debunk the notion of exorcisms in general. But I think when you do that, you bring this way too, is that people think that's the perception of what happened. But I think it can be effective of going, that little jump moment of wait, this actually happened?
It's more...
The trick can work.
That's the trick, right? On horror, it works as a nice trick. And I appreciate that. I appreciate what people are trying to do with that. The problem is that spills out now into most genres of film, and when somebody's watching a drama and you get a lot of these based on a true story, that starts to be a little different. It starts to play a little different.
Well, yeah, and I think because then, again, if it's your only understanding of that event or that group of people, then you can really be misled. But
start to take it as a lot of people, and I'm certainly somebody that's been fooled with this many times and then have to go back, is you especially when it's a story you don't really know. Yeah. Argo's a great example of this.
Oh, yeah.
Now that one at least has a lot of framework, but really it's so disjointed of any reality, again, of truth, I should say. But
no, and I don't disagree. And I think in the horror genre, I think it's used as kind of a parlor trick. It's not dissimilar to Hitchcock saying no one will be admitted after the start of the film. It adds a mystique to it.
I want that. Why can't we get that?
Right. Or people giving it, a horror studio sending in barf bags or sending saying you have to sign a waiver. I think the based on a true story is the lo-fi version of that. It's the non-committal parlor trick to bring people in. But getting into this film. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are already previewing, and I think you've already really nicely explained. It's based on a true story, comes with some really heavy subject matter, and obviously there's a grit to the story, and then also some very funny behind the scenes. Why did we pick this film today? Of all the films we could have done for episode 2, why are we talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
So I think the question is, how could you not think that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most well-crafted and beautifully shot films of all time?
This is something I've heard you say for years and years. And it's a really hard thing because of the word you use, because you use the word beautiful. And I think that is the last word people think about when they think about this film. But I don't disagree with you because it is really beautiful. But it's horrific, too.
There's a lot in this film and a lot going on, and it's not going to be for everybody because, if nothing else, the last 10 to 15 minutes is hard. It is a hard watch.
I always brace myself. Now, it's interesting is I'm going to actually say there was another scene that I don't know why I couldn't deal with this time. I actually, if you were watching me, you would have seen me looking away from the screen. But I completely agree with you. The ending is really hard, but like there's this, it's a very jarring introduction because you get that great John Larroquette voiced narration, which you mimicked so well at the beginning of our show. And then these shots of photographs and that noise that, so the sound designer Wayne Bell calls it the stinger. Because he won't explain what the sound actually is, but he calls it the stinger. And it's, and if you know the noise, I swear I'm not going to try and mimic the noise.
It's a great noise.
It really
is a jarring noise. Yeah.
It's awful. I've always thought it sounds like when an old camera bulb goes out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've always assumed was the assumption that that's what it was supposed to be, especially in that opening shot when it's doing the quick cuts. So that's what I thought. I know that they used a lot of actual meatpacking plant tools and stuff like that to make noises through this movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I read an interview with Wayne Bell, and he was like doing a retrospective on it, and they were actually talking about is that it's like one of the most well-crafted like films in terms of sound design.
Got it. Yeah.
The great thing about this is Wayne Bell, that was not his career path. I mean, he was going to be a filmmaker, but Tobe Hooper told him, "I think you're really good at sound design." He had just gotten done with his freshman year of college when he did the sound design for this film, which is wild.
Yeah, it is wild. And there's a lot of just first time, only time people in this movie. What they did, they were all very young. It's an interesting film. And like I said, it's this weird... We'll talk about this later, of course, but it's such an influential film. Way more than I think people. And I think there's a lot more going on. It's not this just graphic. And something that... I'm just going to put this right out there. This is one of my all-time favorite films, and I can't stand one remake or sequel on it. Maybe Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 has some redeeming qualities because of what Hooper was trying to do. It was kind of the Gremlins 2 of horror films. Like, he was trying to just kind of change it up a little bit, but the rest of them are just, they missed the point of what was going on in this movie.
Well, and I think this movie, much like a lot of the first turns of a horror film when it ends up having sequels, can really get misjudged in terms of like what it is. So if you take the character of Leatherface, you think chainsaws and you think brutality and intense gore and like intestines and gross. That's not what this film is.
No, this is a poor guy that had a home invasion and just trying to protect himself.
Dude, can I tell you, I was writing like a paragraph in my notes about that, and I was like, what am I trying to justify? Because, so one of the things that I think is really jarring about this film is like Leatherface's reaction to when they break into the house, because he lets out that noise. You're like, and you immediately think, I don't think he wanted to kill them. That noise is actually the sound designer's father trying to mimic an animal noise.
Oh, wow, interesting. Okay.
And now
Now, are you talking about when Kirk is hearing like the pig noise?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I should have clarified the pig style noises. But like, and I think that's like the weird thing about this film is it doesn't like look, all right, it is incredibly grotesque what happens in the house, and we are not cannibal apologists. I just want to make that very clear, like at the start of this episode. But it's like hard to not like feel sympathetic to Leatherface, similarly to, I would say, monsters like Frankenstein or the creature from the Black Lagoon.
I think that's a really great example. He is very Frankenstein's monster.
Thank you for clarifying.
Really, I mean, he is. He's confused. You know, there's obviously much more going on with his character. And I don't know if he's necessarily wholeheartedly evil. There's evil acts obviously going on, and it's a little bit of circumstance, right? Of the family he's growing up and what he's being taught and what he's believing he needs to do.
Yeah, and I think you see him as a tortured soul. And I will say this, like, part of, I think, the ability to evaluate Leatherface and see him as potentially more complex than just this, like, brutal murderer is really a credit to Tobe Hooper's direction and the screenplay, which is co-written by Kim Henkel?
Henkel.
Henkel.
Yeah. Do you know Kim Henkel? He wrote and directed one of the other Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies.
Did he do the one with Matthew McConaughey?
Yes, he did.
Of course he did. So, real and true story. The first Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie I saw was actually that one. I saw it late night on, like, Showtime one night when I was, like a teenager. But I think, pushing the sequels aside, but I think that's, like, a credit to the direction. You open up on this really grotesque sculpture of, like, a corpse. You have this, like, entrance point of just young people on a road trip, although they have grim purpose for being on the road trip because they believe the grandfather's grave may have been.
Yeah, they never really give a full explanation of why they're on this road trip. I don't know if it is just to find out about the grandfather. I don't know if it's to explore the house. I don't know if they're going somewhere else and they're just doing this along the way.
I think it may be kind of some sort of combination of what you're saying.
Because Franklin gives the line of, you said it would be fun. I don't think she was going to say, hey, come out to our grandfather's grave and see if he was dug up. This is going to be fun.
No, I think potentially what happens is either they were like, well, we're going on a road trip, but, like, mom or dad needs me to, like, check on this first. And then we'll get to the part with, like, Franklin in the house because he's really the one who kind of unfortunately pushes them towards the danger. Actually, I would blame pretty much everything on Franklin, but because I hate that character. But I think
Franklin's fault at all.
I'll get there. It is Franklin's fault.
If anybody, it's Kirk.
Oh, it is actually a little bit Kirk's fault, yeah. But the thing I think is, like, really great about that setup is, like, yeah, they're just there, and, like, there's kind of I love that you have there's this really terrifying moment, and you hear a kid in the background just saying repeatedly at the cemetery, "Mama, let's go," and crying. It reminds me a lot of an opening or an early scene in the Blair Witch Project where the child's crying as she's, like, telling the story.
And she the kid keeps trying to, like, grab her mouth to have her stop.
And that's all it reminded me of. And you have, like, it's weird, like, people are, like, looking at the graves, they're trying to find this out. You have this awesome radio play, like, news updates that are happening, which I always find to be a very haunting and effective tool in a horror movie whenever you're having news kind of, explained to you that way. It's kind of filling in. So we get the sense that, as we will find out, the hitchhiker has been doing this a lot. And this has become a problem. He's making art out of human flesh. And there's something really grotesque and weird and again, kind of, like, thinking about, like, kind of counterculture at the time and, like, owning bodies and who owns them. Like, it's a very weird thing that's happening that opens up this film, and then, then we travel along on a little bit of an idyllic road trip until it goes completely south.
You're right. Some things to talk about with this movie, I think, I would say up front, but we're
deep
deep in. This movie for Hooper was to be essentially a retelling of Hansel and Gretel.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I totally see it now.
Yeah, so the whole, leading to a house, trying to find, something that you need or want. There's actually some, eating and stuff like that in the actual Hansel and Gretel thing. But essentially that was it. Another aspect of where Cooper gets this is, is the Ed Gein story. Very notable. That is where you are going to get the tidbit of based on a true story, is because murderer Ed Gein in Wisconsin, he had worn human skin, and that's where that's taking place. Ed Gein, weirdly, is very influential into the horror community because he's essentially what the book Psycho is based upon.
Yes.
Which then gets obviously, Hitchcock takes and makes into one of the greatest classic films of all time.
Yeah.
And also Silence of the Lambs is also loosely based there on it.
So it's really interesting because they seem to use this one story because I think it's so befuddling to the human mind that this happened, that you have this serial murderer who is, these additional grotesque trophies that come from this, and trying to understand that. And then that gets expressed a lot in horror, because if we think about this, and I'm sure this is something that's, most people think when you think about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's kind of like that next frontier in horror, and it weirdly enough handled this with as much subtlety as I think you could, given what the setup of the film is and the influences, but at the same time also, is trying to capture something that's like this, the most horrifying side of humanity, and how do you capture that in a way and then beautifully, have it be something that's like beautifully shot and youthful and vibrant. It's a very weird interplay.
The funny part about this movie is it's considered one of, a lot of people have this envision and it's considered to be this very graphic and difficult film. I think now it's been talked to death about how non-graphic it actually is and how much it's played with your mind, but Hooper was trying to get a PG rating. Now, keep in mind, there was no PG-13 at this point. But he was actually, that's why there is very little to no blood. I think Hooper had said there's like 2 ounces of blood.
Which, if I believe, I think it's Franklin's death that's actually...
Franklin's death, yeah. Now, I do think that's a little bit, because there's definitely blood on costuming and things, but actual seeing of like blood kind of going out was Franklin's death. The other is, if you notice, there's no cursing in this movie. So the language was all kept down on it. So so these are these things. Now, obviously, the film was so intense, it was still fighting not to even get an X rating at that time.
Because, not dissimilar to the battle that Hitchcock had with Psycho, so it's apropos you bring this up, is that there's so much suggested and there's so much you believe. And actually, so the sound editor talked about this, Wayne Bell. He said, he was like, there's so much you think you're seeing that you're not. There's so much you think you're hearing that you're not. It's just your imagination fills in exactly what it needs to if you're manipulated the right way, And I think that's like the really important thing to consider with this. And I think too, because it does start weirdly in just like kind of what seems like a carefree space, not the beginning of the film, but like when we're with the travelers. So when we're with, Franklin, Pam, and Sally, and Jerry, and Kirk, they're just doing, kind of like normal teenage activity. They're on a road trip. It feels, like they have a very easy way about them. But I always find it interesting because I feel like when Pam brings in the astrology, I often think that there's a very like kind of like mystical aspect of this film. It feels like they were fated to have this happen to them. Like she just, when she's reading like, Sally's like horoscope, and I forget, it's something I forget, there's something that Pam says, or no, that's right, it's in Sally's horoscope. She reads, there are moments that we can't believe what is happening is true. That's part of Sally's horoscope. And it's like, and I think about that last moment with her when she's in the pickup truck, and it's this mania and relief, and also this understanding of like, what just happened to me? Like, I'm getting away, but what just happened to me? So her horoscope is so predictive, and there is something about this, like, and I know I jokingly said I think this is Franklin's fault, which I do think it's kind of, because I do feel like he's kind of pushing the trajectory of some things, but it also feels like this was going to happen. And I know it's like horrific, but it does feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, but you have it, I mean, the Harbinger, essentially, at the cemetery when they're looking for the grandfather. And again, we're talking about way this film's shot. It's just that Texas sun, beating down, even how it's playing off of the tombstones. I like how they kind of have this discussion, and the gentleman takes Sally's like, I'm going to take your girl here. I'm going to help her out, right? And everybody's trying to be like real help, that Southern hospitality, trying to be helpful. But then you have this drunk guy that's essentially telling Franklin, like, I've been seeing things and something's going down. Like, this is not good.
No, you're exactly right. And he's passed off because he said things happened here they'll tell about.
Yeah.
is what the harbinger says. So the harbinger being a like a filmic term, it's used in the movie Cabin in the Woods, where essentially the harbinger is the person that warns the teenagers of like the coming doom. You know, and that's used in horror films, but I think it works really well here. And there is something about that, like it feels like it's being so forecasted up, you know, and then definitively when they pick up the hitchhiker, like that just becomes another step in the process.
Right. Talk about a different time, right? Like it's like they don't even really think too much about it. Should we pick them up? Yeah, it's hot out there. We don't want anything to happen to them. Like, you know.
And it feels like such a kindness. And I often wonder, like, at what point, because, like, you know, so the hitchhiker sequence is very uncomfortable. And what I really appreciate about how this was directed is they kind of don't react at first. Right. Like, there's no dramatic, like, no one, it's not like Kirk, like, he lunges at him, or it's very much just they try and keep calm, because you can see how uncomfortable. And again, this, like, they don't understand that they could be in danger. Like, it doesn't occur to them. You're right. They just go, well, just pick up the hitchhiker. It's hot. Yeah. Like, don't make the guy walk. And the fact that then he
well, and I love how Hooper shoots this scene, though, right? Because it's cutting back and forth between the hitchhiker and the kids. And we'll call them kids. I think they're in their 20s. It's straight on shot of the hitchhiker. So we're on level with the hitchhiker. But the shot is low angle on the kids. Again, I'm using kids. I apologize, crew, whatever you want to. And you're looking up, and I think that's really telling too. It's kind of like they pick them up, and their immediate thought is, "This guy's weird and strange and beneath us," and looking down on him. And I just think that's an interesting way that he shoots that entire scene. Everybody, but then doesn't choose to shoot it that way for the hitchhiker.
No, and I'm glad you pointed that, because then isn't there some element here of a snobbery we understand? Because they judge him really kind of before he does anything weird, but can you also kind of blame them for judging him at the same time? Right. Because of what happens.
It doesn't take long for things to get real out of hand, you know. And again, I agree with you. Franklin isn't helpful. Franklin is one of the most annoying characters in film history. And it's intentional, though, right? Like, that character, he was played by Paul Partain, and Paul Partain actually intentionally went method, and he thought he had to. You know, my gosh. Everybody hated him. Gunnar Hansen talks about how he was so happy to kill him. Like, they just could not stand him. And it was like, and him and Marilyn Burns actually got in actual fights. Like, it was Marilyn Burns who plays Sally. So, like, he says, like, I tried to. That's what my character was. So that's who I thought I had to be.
But you know what? And I'm glad you bring that up, because then, the reactions are very genuine to him. Franklin always reminds me, there's a wonderful short story by Flannery O'Connor called A Good Man is Hard to Find. And really the way in which the family in that story get into danger is because the grandmother is convinced, like, that's our family's house back there, and ends up not being. But I always think about that with Franklin whenever I watch the sequence of him, like, oh, we'll go up here to this house. And it's like, you think about, there's probably conversations where they're like, no, we have to get gas. No, we're going here instead. But you realize that Franklin kind of pushes them towards their, like, certain doom, and then is, like, mad about the fact that they're there. It's he's a very hard character to feel any type of sympathy for when he finally does get killed by Leatherface, because he's so odious and so cranky, when the rest of the characters are just all very even.
Yes. Yeah. But he is. I mean, he's, you know, he's the, you know, fifth person there. Like, he's not one of the couples. So he's going to feel like the outsider already. But
I think that's then the brilliant thing about, like, what Tobe Hooper does, is you brought up earlier with Leatherface, is, like, he makes characters multifaceted, because then in some ways you're like, well, there have to be so many aspects of Franklin's life that have been challenging. He seems uncomfortable in the space he's in. He is with two couples. That's always kind of uncomfortable. So I do think that's, again, like, kind of the brilliance of, like, writing a character that I will say, like, oh, I kind of hate, but then, like, giving him layers. I was imagining when we were watching this past time, I was like, I wonder if there should be a prequel film where we find out that that Franklin is actually one of the Sawyers and that he was adopted.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're living right next to the Sawyers.
Doesn't he seem more like a Sawyer, if we're being honest?
Very true. The other thing Hooper does here with the hitchhiker, which I think it kind of speaks to what he was trying to tell and why there's so much more layers to this film, is like you're hearing this conversation about what's going on at the slaughterhouse and the change. And that's talking about this big change in technology, right? And how technology is taking away jobs, which makes people more desperate and puts people in different circumstances. So, like, again, the hitchhiker is, to use your term, odious and not a good person, but there's things that he's saying that are very important to why all this has kind of happened and why they're a little bit the way that they are, a little bit, and also more speaking of the time and what Hooper's really trying to get at. The other thing I think it's also interesting is Hooper became a vegetarian from this film, so not really surprising.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, and part of, the production history of this, as you've been forecasting, is really interesting. I mean, they shot in a summer in Texas, which is brutal just on its own, let alone in the 70s. And the conditions for this were incredibly harsh. I mean, you're not talking about, they didn't have modern creature comforts. They didn't have like a massive budget. There were no trailers. I mean, people were getting heat exhaustion, and it smelled.
Yeah, it was an awful, I mean, so we had the, before Gunnar Hansen, sadly passed away, we had the opportunity to meet him. He wrote a great book where a lot of what we're talking about today comes from. It's called Chainsaw Confidential. If you're able to find a copy or listen to it on audio, I really highly recommend it. It's really interesting. And this was, it was a horrible, horrible set and a horrible time making it. He always talked to that when people would ask him. He would say, no, I did not have fun. It was absolutely one of the worst times of my life. I apologize, the gentleman that played the hitchhiker, his name's escaping me at the moment. Edwin Neal. He served in Vietnam and said for him this was worse than the time he served in Vietnam. And the thing I was going to say about with Gunnar Hansen, who was one of the most kind celebrities we ever met. He just sat there and just took the time to talk with us. It was great. He wrote in the book, now you know the real horror was making the film. And it's when you hear about these conditions, 100 degrees. When we get to the house, 115 to 120 degrees in the house. It's just, they could not change the costumes. They only had one costume. So they could not change those costumes or wash them during the month that they were in them. Marilyn Bergen's costume was so caked and so bad by the end, they said they could snap it in half, essentially.
Oh.
Like, it was just, I guess people stopped talking and going near Gunnar Hansen because he just smelled so horrendous.
And the thing is truly is like, and this has been written about a lot. He is so kind. He's such like a kind and gentle person. I imagine how isolating this shoot had to feel because everyone's just miserable. So do you really find that sense of camaraderie ever? But like at that, like when you watch it, especially before the brutality really kicks in, the way in which this is shot is so beautiful. They don't look like they're in these miserable conditions. I mean, yes, they talk about the heat as characters, but like even one of the things I really appreciate is how many times Tobe Hooper pulls away and puts us in these objective shots in the grass watching, particularly you see this with Pam and Kirk when they're walking to the creek and there's just these sunflowers or the daisies, I can't remember. And the way the camera's situated, because it's beautiful and it's wild and it's it's unkempt, but in that like really gorgeous natural way. And you have all these beautiful shots with the sun shining, and then you get that start of like moving almost into like golden hour. Like it's beautiful, but it's also really creepy because you feel like I feel like I'm the villain watching you,
right?
Like, or I'm being forced to...
He does a great job. Yeah, I'm sorry I spoke over you. I apologize.
No, I just feel like you're being forced to watch them walk towards their deaths. And when you take this in context of Vietnam and the first televised war, you have to wonder how intentional some of that was. Watching them in the line, in the grass. Completely.
One of the things I wrote a lot down during watching it this time, it feels like a found footage film. It's not, but it feels that way. I got a lot of Blair Witch vibes with it. You feel like you're with these characters, or like you're talking about, almost a voyeuristic place of watching these characters. And it can be done so wonderfully, but it's also very creepy.
Well, and truly, because you have really everything like leading up to it is like really beautiful. And, until like, obviously there's grotesque things earlier in the film, and you have the hitchhiker, but it's really not until Kirk's death, like, I would say, because the first third of this film is so calm. Oh, yeah. Comparatively speaking, especially to the last 15 minutes.
Well, we also have they meet the cook for the first time at the gas station, which for me, I will never, I mean, we just did a cross-country trip, and this is why I fill up at every gas station. I mean, we're in 2021, and pretty much there is a gas station every so many miles, but like, for movies like this, I will always fill up because I'm so petrified to run out of gas.
I can testify to that fact. Yeah, you really do. When we were in Ireland, you were so freaked out because there are not as many gas stations or petrol stations in Ireland, and you were like, what am I going to do? Like, yeah, 100%, because there is that. And also, too, the way in which he seems to be dissuading them constantly. Oh, yeah. From stopping at the house. Right? You're like, I don't think they wanted this trouble. I just think, unfortunately, they were very ready if it came to their door.
The gas station is now you could stay there.
It's like an Airbnb.
It's I think more like just a motel.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah,
like a
but it's also a barbecue joint. So
100% we would go.
Yes, absolutely.
It's so gross, but we would go.
I also like that character that's just cleaning the windshield that never comes back later, and he just follows the cook as the cook comes up and he cleans the window. The cook walks away.
It's like the last little bit of comedy in the film, the last like kind of moment of just like this absurd, but it's also like coming with this like really ominous warning, and then you have the players in the film kind of split off, as unfortunately sometimes characters do in horror movies, and weirdly totally unaware of like each other's impending doom. Like there's nothing about this situation, and it kind of speaks to like kind of a capturing of like their innocent moment of there's nothing about this that seems off to them. Going to an abandoned house, I don't know why you would do that, but they do, and that doesn't seem strange. And then when the creek's dried up, they don't take that as like maybe we should just go back to the van.
I also think it's very interesting because there's search of gas, and this is during the oil crisis, 73, so obviously that's real telling, again, with Hooper there, but I'm with you. Again, a different time. Like, he's just like, oh, I'm going to give them my guitar, and we're going to get something, get out of here, and he sees all those cars and doesn't really think anything of it, even though we know now what those cars are, like,
and
right?
what it means,
and what it means. Yeah. So,
and you hear it because he hears a generator, and so he immediately goes, "Oh, there's someone," and not out of they're so desperate for help. It's no, they're just. He hears and thinks there's people. They must be good intentions.
This is what I'm talking about with the crafted of the film. Like, we get them from far away, and you can hear that generator, and it's this beacon for them to follow. And just that generator is just getting louder and louder and louder. And then it actually starts to almost be deafening once you finally get there for you as the audience.
Yes.
And then it's, again, kind of, we get to, Kirk just finds a tooth on the ground. And just gives it down,
so gross.
And then this is also where Hooper changes his shot, right? Because now you're at the house. The shot's from above looking down on Kirk and Pam as he's coming up to the house. And I think that all of a sudden changes who's in control at this point.
No, and I'm glad you point that out because I think that's like a brilliant analysis to look at this as like, okay, now you're on Leatherface's territory. Like, you shouldn't be here. You are an outsider that should not have been coming to this place. I don't care how innocent your intentions were, but you're coming here mining for goods and you're not supposed to be here. Again, works really well thematically with time period. Yeah. But Kirk's death happens so fast.
Oh my gosh, right?
It comes out of nowhere. Yeah. Yes, we're talking about it's so forecasted, but also feels so abrupt. And he just hits him, and then the door slams.
Yeah. You get that twitch, which is so disturbing.
Oh, I hate that twitch.
Here Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he comes out, he doesn't even have a chainsaw. That quick introduction to him, terrifying. One of the icons of, horror film is there. And then, like you said, quick, hit it, and then that slam of the door, and all of a sudden you hear that tone play differently, right? That ominous tone.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, most of like any of the things that sound like kind of like that discordant music in the film was all done with like children's instruments.
Of course.
That they like manipulated to make it sound that way. And then, from there we, because now we're really in it. We're in the part of this that probably it's most well known for. And then you get that incredible low angle shot of Pam going into the house. One of the most iconic, I think, shots in horror film history and just film history in general. It's so beautiful. And she's about to be killed so brutal. Well, I mean, I don't know. We never actually see her dead.
That's true.
But
yeah, I mean, when I talk about this is maybe my all-time favorite shot of a film. And no, I do not think, I know that there can be people that look at this in a different way, because
you mean people who sexualize
it.
Okay.
And even the woman that played Pam, she talked about that being jarring the first time. She thought it was a great shot until she saw it the first time, and then was like, "Oh, there I am." But she learned to really love it later on. But that's you seeing it, right? Like any person that sees themselves on film feels a little differently and stuff. But to me, it's just that was a last minute decision to put that scene in.
Really.
So Hooper and I apologize. The cinematographer, who I don't have his name in front of me at the moment, they actually came up with the idea. The producer did not want them to do it because it wasn't storyboarded. It wasn't in the thing. He didn't want them wasting their time, but they had this idea of this low angle tracking shot following her, and they ended up winning out, and obviously it becomes, one of the most, again, iconic shots of the film. And I think it works perfectly. It's a beautiful shot. It's amazingly done. You have this horrific situation she's walking into, but it's just beautiful sunlight, and I love how it's just that house. It's just foreboding. It's just getting bigger and bigger and starts to engulf her as she gets closer, not realizing what she's walking into. I just think that shot, I could sit there and do an entire episode just on that shot alone. You did a really wonderful 40th birthday present for me where you did this retrospective video and you used a lot of movie clips, and that, I believe, was one of the first clips you used, and I was just like, yes. So
well, because I know how much you love that shot, and I think it's like, I think what's incredible about it is, like, yes, Kirk is already dead, but there's just this sense of, like, we really know what she's going for. First off, that house is beautiful. It looks like, on the outside, looks well-maintained. And
now a cafe. They moved it. It's not where it used to be. It's now a cafe you can visit as well.
Just do a Texas Chainsaw Massacre food tour.
Right.
But this is a good, example of fight for your art. Like, Tobe Hooper, and the cinematographer's name is Daniel Pearl.
Thank you.
This is why you fight for those things, because then you get these iconic moments. And I applaud them for going with their gut and knowing that this is something that was going to have to be there, because then, like, what happens next? Of all of the deaths in the film, or supposed deaths, I find hers the most jarring. The hook is really hard. You don't see a lot, you don't hear a lot, but so much is suggested about what she's going through.
Well, this is our first real introduction of the madness of this house when she comes in there, and Robert Burns, who was the art director. So these are all real bones. Yeah. He had the job of going around the Texas countryside collecting bones. That's an actual human skeleton that's in the movie, because back in those days, like, everybody talks about poltergeists and the real skeletons and how it cursed the film. And the joke kind of was that wasn't that uncommon back in the day, because it was cheaper to get real bones than it was to get fake bones.
Yeah.
The armadillo was actually a dead armadillo that he taxidermied. Like, he's the one that created the feel and that griminess. And that's the other thing we talked about, the heat. This is a movie, you feel that heat throughout it. Not that fake heat that the remakes give you. Like, you can feel what they're going through. And when she goes into that room, you know that smell's got to be awful in there.
Yes.
Yes. And then she tries to escape. And it's that great shot of her going down the hallway, and she gets out, and you get the daylight, and Leatherface just grabs her and brings her back into the darkness of that house. It is horrible and so well done at the same time.
Yes.
Sorry. And then you bring it into the spot that you're talking about, which is the meat hook, which, is probably, again, these iconic moments of the film.
And then you're watching, she's watching Kirk's body get, chainsawed apart. Right. And then you get this, like, weird sense that, like, Leatherface is panicking. Like, he almost doesn't know what to do. Like, obviously...
Everybody keeps just coming into this guy's house!
Poor Leatherface.
Well, I think that's more after Jerry, right? But,
Well, yeah, and then, because then what follows not long after is Jerry's death.
Yes.
You have that weird panic of, they realize their friends are missing, but they're not. It's weird. It's like a low grade panic. I think they don't have a sense of like what's coming. We know as the audience, so I think we feel the tension of that more. He doesn't let Sally come with him. Which is, obviously becomes very important later on. And you also start to have this transition, like we've gone from this daylight and kind of like the hopefulness of like what their road trip was supposed to be. And we start to descend into night, which starts to make a lot of this feel even more uncertain. And Jerry's death, it's interesting. I would still say Pam's is much more brutal, but the scream he lets out when he sees Leatherface is...
Well, it's weird talking about these things in this way, like, because right before that you get that amazing shot of Jerry with the sun setting.
Yes.
And you get him going in, and it's at this point it's starting, the sun setting and the madness is just completely on these kids. And the things with, I thought with the Pam on the hook is that really is interesting to pair it with Psycho. And talking about the shower scene, because it's, again, these quick cuts of not what you're seeing. And that's also the first introduction of the chainsaw.
Yes.
The chainsaw, which is not really used that much as it's so, put with this character. And then, like you talked about, then you have Jerry coming in there and he sees Pam, who is still alive at this point.
Yes.
Gone through hell, but is still alive in the freezer. And then all of a sudden, again, that quick death and that noise that he lets out. And then you have Leatherface running around the house trying to figure out what's happening. He's looking out the window. And then Gunnar Hansen, who had talked about, like, there's so little to do with this character, but he emotes so much. And just that facial expression that he gives of, from fear to confusion to calm, that we know what's going on in this very bizarre character's head.
Well, yeah, and there's something very wild and sad in his eyes. Like, there's something like, and I think that's, again, it's the, how do you create empathy or a space for understanding with a monster when most of their face is covered in makeup or a mask? Right. And this is definitely, much like Boris Karloff, like, and Lon Chaney, like this is someone who knew how to create a space where, like, you could see that there was something more with the monster. You could start to analyze it deeply. I don't think you have that with the human faces in this film. I don't think the hitchhiker, certainly creates, like, empathetic spaces. I certainly don't think the old man does. Nor does grandfather.
Two things, you talked about the face, with Leatherface. So this is one of his 3 faces that he wears throughout the movie.
Yes.
So Hooper gets this idea for doing this character, for this mask, he knew a doctor. And the doctor, who, when he was in med school, was going to a Halloween party and actually skinned a cadaver and made a mask.
No!
Yes.
This can't be true.
This is from Hooper himself that he told this. He had done, with a Texas Monthly, he did an article. He also explained how he came up with the idea of the chainsaw and where the chainsaw came in. So the chainsaw, he was actually, in 1972, he was at Christmas shopping. It was insanity. He was getting basically claustrophobic, couldn't figure out how to get out. He was panicking. He looks over and he sees a rack of chainsaws and his head goes, I know how I can clear a path. And that's how he literally leaves there, goes home, and that's when he starts he said the story just came from him, and he literally, that night, boom, 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 he hits all these major sequences of the film.
Thank goodness for the panic of the holiday shopping season. Or else perhaps we don't have Leatherface. Makes my Leatherface Santa ornament feel a lot more, like, relevant than it used to.
Right, so this can be a,
alternative Christmas movie. Taking it back to season 1. And I know there's so many production stories with this, but, like, a lot of that inspiration kind of makes sense because there is something that feels like, as bizarre and extreme as the circumstances of this film feel, there's also so much of it that just feels relatable, like panic and anxiety and societal fears and brutality, and there's so much that feels very raw, no pun intended, about this film. It kind of makes sense, like, where some of that inspiration comes from. And as we certainly move into the nightmarish night sequence of this film, I'm gonna get, so when Sally reaches the house, first off, the contrast between the cinematography of the day and the night, I think, is done so well. Mm-hmm. The naturalistic approach to lighting, very Kubrick, Barry Lyndon in particular. But there's actually something that I think like marks something to me that feels very Kubrick when Sally gets to the house. I feel like that shot of the room with Grandpa and Grandma and that low ceiling feels so Kubrick. Yeah. And I mean that as a high compliment to the film. And is so horrifying because she has no idea what's coming. She has no idea how bad this is about to get. And that seems terrifying enough. And you know that, she's going to at some point get strapped down to a literal armchair.
Right. Nice.
But it's just that moment of going, she found the creepy thing in the attic, which should be scary enough.
Right.
But it's about, because in Psycho, the scary thing is that the corpse is still in the house.
Yeah.
This gets so much worse from there.
So this is the extended sequence of the chase scene with Sally. So a couple of notes to go on with this and talking about this horrible shoot, right? Whereas, so they used a real chainsaw. And Gunnar Hansen actually trips and falls and the chainsaw nearly hits him.
No, it's awful.
Legitimately, he just said in the night he had no idea,
Oh, wow.
The other funny story he tells about this is, so Gunnar Hansen had never done marijuana before, never did. So on the last day of shoot, which is when this is, he takes a pot brownie or some type of, edible type marijuana, and he ends up doing this while he still has to shoot the scene where he saws down the door. So if you see him come in and look like doesn't know which way to go, even though Sally's literally running down the stairs at him, it's because he was so confused. And he talks about this. So he also talks about how he had moments of starting to forget what was reality and not reality, which gets real bizarre.
But the section Chainsaw Confidential where he talks about, didn't he say, he almost stabbed, the actress?
Well, he does actually do that, which we're going to get to here in just a few moments.
Sorry.
But no. But he said there was a brief moment where he thought he was supposed to chase and kill her. So... strange.
Also,
this is the very kind man we're talking about.
Yeah, the very kind Gunnar Hansen that we're talking about. But also, is there a low-key, kind of spiritual, shared universe where Dazed and Confused as a film about weed, as you have explained it to me, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre exists?
You mean a film about Texas kids?
Yeah.
On one day?
Yeah.
I totally agree with you.
I'm going to recut the beginning of this, but have Slow Ride playing.
Right. This might actually work as a better pairing than Fast Times did with Dazed and
Truly.
Confused last week.
Yeah, so you get Sally's escape, and you get, the barbecue sequence. Oh, the barbecue house.
Oh, God. It's just, you feel so bad for Sally.
So this is the part I can't watch. I can't watch the part when she gets into the pickup truck and she's in the bag. I can't take it. I really honestly can't. And my tolerance for it has gotten worse with time. She's so helpless and he's so maniacal. Yeah. But acting as though he's not. He said, at some point doesn't he say, I don't have a stomach for killing?
Yeah, he says that later at the dinner scene.
Yeah,
yes.
And it's just, but he's so... And that's the thing, is I will still situate that Leatherface is less detestable than the old man because...
I think we call him the cook in this.
Oh, is he called the cook? I thought he's referred to as the old man in this.
Okay, maybe. Maybe you're right.
Maybe
you
mistaken.
know what? He ends up, I believe his name's actually Braden Sawyer, which we find out later films. But yeah. Old man cook. Sorry, that works both.
Yeah, because the Sawyer name doesn't come in until the sequels. We referenced it earlier.
Yes.
But it's so... horrifying. And the thing is we've already experienced intense brutality in this film, but there's something about it that just it sets my teeth on edge.
And then Sally's just starting to figure out what's going on, that she's just waiting for him to come back in. Yeah. And then like you said, the sadistic laughter and kind of feeling recoiling about it, but then enjoyment. Very bizarre. And then it gets to one of my favorite shots of the film.
What's
the two things that happen. So we find the hitchhiker, and we finally find out that the hitchhiker's with this family.
Yes.
And he sees him running down the road, and I think the shot when he gets out of the car and he's arguing and kind of almost beating up the hitchhiker, and they're in this fight, but when you have the headlights on it, just amazingly shot. And it starts to be some of this really dark humor that starts to come up, because then we get to the house, and this is when we find out that the three of them are brothers. And he gives out the, "Look what your brother did to the door."
Don't you have any self-respect? Don't you have any respect in his house? It's like, what? And I was like, everyone has morals.
Right?
That's what you learn.
It's this weird family values of this bizarre, horrible family. And they all kind of serve their purpose.
Yeah, and it's this weird, because you see kind of like the emotional and physical abuse that happens in this house. You understand that Leatherface, although the most physically intimidating of the three, seems to be the one that is browbeat the most, and maybe because he is more physically capable of like the things that they're doing, you have this love and respect for their somewhat mummified grandfather, who, how old he has to be.
He's supposed to be 124, I believe, somewhere along the weird timeline that they give.
That's so gross.
I just found that out, so I don't know where that truth comes from, but I did hear that today, or find that out today. This scene, so this is where this whole thing is shot over 27 hours.
The dinner sequence.
Ugh. They said it is just horrible. So what happens is the gentleman who was 19 at the time, who plays the grandfather, had to get put in the makeup for 10 hours. He hated it so much, he declared, "I'm doing this once and once only." So they had to shoot the entire thing over 27 hours. Give or take, there's some discrepancies, but this is where they said the food, it was 115 to 120 degrees in the house. The food that they were putting on the tables was just rotten. Everybody kept having to run out and vomit. Like, legitimately.
That's the worst kind of dinner party.
Right? And then this is where we have this horrific, they bring down Grandpa, and they're going to cut Sally's finger. So this is this horrible behind-the-scenes portion that goes, "Ryan, why do you love this movie? Why have you been waxing so poetically about Gunnar Hansen?" So at this point, they're losing their minds, basically. And they're supposed to cut Marilyn Burns' finger and have Grandpa suck on it. And basically this is what he's feeding off of. Well, the special effect keeps breaking. It's not working. So there's a guard on the knife. Finally, Gunnar Hansen just had enough. He's like, he doesn't tell anybody, and he takes the guard off of the knife and actually cuts her finger, and then actually lets her put her finger into the gentleman that was playing Grandpa, who didn't know that this was real blood. So, yeah.
Indecencies upon indecencies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like, and this is the thing. There is something...
Pretty sure that would have been career-ending today.
Yeah. There is something to kind of, like, films, particularly when it's in someone's early part of their career, someone who clearly is a visionary or has a vision for their film, when there's low budget, and you get these stories. You don't want them to be like this. Like, no. And Gunnar Hansen talking about those stories, we saw him at a panel, he did a Q&A, and definitely in that book, Chainsaw Confidential, like, he doesn't... It's weird, like, he does it with a very dark sense of humor when he talks about it, but you also get the sense of, like, no, this was traumatizing.
Yes.
Because reality had so disappeared, or the lines between what we were filming and reality had so disappeared, that stuff like this happened. And they were put under such intense pressure to be able to film these scenes in such horrid conditions. I can see how it happens. And honestly, it comes through. The scene feels brutal and disgusting and hot and odorous. I will tell you, as someone with misophonia, like, it's very challenging, the noises that are in the scene. Yeah. I find them very hard to listen to personally. You have these harsh family dynamics, the mock yelling and crying that they're doing, which so reminds me of the Cask of Amontillado. Like, like, just that, like, you know, that, like, whole exchange between Montresor and Fortunato and that Edgar Allan Poe story, like, the mock yelling, like, it feels so inhumane. And the fact that I could still be surprised by the inhumanity of this sequence, but I think there's something about how Tobe Hooper ramps this up, that by the time you get to the dinner sequence, whether they were going to kill her or not, it feels the most unsettling and unnerving. part of the film.
It really is, and you're seeing these dynamics between, and at this point we're getting Leatherface's at third, his formal wear, and you're finding out the dynamic that the cook isn't who she thinks. She thinks he's the leader, and she's trying to beg to him, and he's not giving in to any of that. You find, she offers up some really just horrific things, to help her.
It's horrifying.
And you find out that that's not something that they care about at all, that they're just have their own sadistic ways about them. It's an unsettling scene. I can't pretend that it's not.
No, and you think about the assumptive nature of like how she pleads for her life and what like she is unfortunately willing to give, and you realize like the brutality of the sequences, she immediately positions that the horrors that she expects to, have done onto her body. Like she is fully prepared because she just wants to live, and it's like that panic and that yelling, it's so unnerving, and she's just pleading so much until the moment that she's not, and she escapes.
Yeah, well, we have the dark humor of them trying to get Grandpa to hit her. Which he just keeps dropping.
Because that's right, because the old man says, like, the line is, I just can't take no pleasure in killing, and then they keep talking about why Grandpa's, like, so much better at killing than anyone else, and you realize that's the grandfather that's been referenced earlier by the hitchhiker in the van, and he can't do it, and it's, like, really awkward, and then she just bolts through the window.
Oh my god, and this is our second her jumping through the window, and at this point we see that it's daylight. And that's the change, right? Like, now she's running, and this to me is one of my favorite endings of a film of all time.
Yeah, truly, yeah.
Her running away from him, and you have that shot, the hitchhikers coming after, and them trying to chase her down, and what they choose to do with this ending is just very interesting to what we've been dealing with at this point. So she gets out there. You have the cook ends up surviving because he never comes out.
Yeah.
The hitchhiker gets run over by this truck.
Yes.
I love that you have the sequence of the truck driver getting out to like find out what, to help and find out what happened, and all of a sudden sees Leatherface come around and is like, nope.
Smartest character in a horror movie ever. Just run.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do?
Although I don't understand, why does he get in the truck and not drive away? Why does he get out the other side?
Fear
But he's smart enough to get the wrench, throws it at it, hits Leatherface, cuts the leg, and you're just having, again, this madness. Another truck coming up.
Yeah.
That's when Sally gets it. You're talking about the first driver, he just books it down the road.
Yeah.
And then we get two shots to me that just signify you have Sally get away, and this is your final girl, right? Like the final girl trope, and this is your hero essentially of the film, and just the face that she makes, this fear and then kind of almost insanity that's going over her. Just it's tough to watch.
Yeah, and I think, like, kind of the overt, like, feminine colors that she's wearing, the lavender that's, does have blood on it now, and, like, how blood-soaked her face is, this, like, rising sun, and, which, earlier that sun, feels, like, so important to kind of the youthful vibrance of, like, going on a road trip. It now becomes, like, something so twisted, and that beautiful shot then of, like, Leatherface, like, with the dance with the sun behind him.
Yeah.
And what's really like, you could feel like, well, this is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, does it end? Hopefully, no, because, and I think this is what Tobe Hooper, and maybe the clincher of his argument, alive, but fully traumatized. And it seems so important to some of the heavier, like, world issues and themes that he was trying to tackle, what we see with her at the end.
It is. And you saying that, there's one last piece of trivia that I think is really interesting to Tobe Hooper in understanding this film, and you talking about that, which I found out. So the Charles Whitman, who was the gunman in Texas at the University of Texas, in the 70s that had went to the tower and shot.
Yeah.
Tobe Hooper was there.
Oh, wow.
During that. And actually, a police officer came to him and told him this was happening. And Hooper didn't move right away because wasn't sure, and actually saw one of the police officers get shot, or a security guard or police officer. So, it's... you talk about the trauma that you see in Marilyn Burns, Sally's character at the end, and I think that really speaks to what Tobe Hooper was trying to put into this, like, and where his state of mind was, and the person he was, and all of the things that was going on with this mid-20-year-old, first-time director.
Well, and, I'll ask this because I feel like, I think you're already making the argument for this. Is this the most influential horror movie of the 20th century?
Yes. I mean, it's got to be one of. It's certainly, I think, way more than anybody realizes, or most people realize.
Because I think it's easier to reduce the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to the more flamboyant portions of it, the more brutal portions of it, and then the really unfortunate sequels that come after it. But there's no denying that so many horror films really owe. It's kind of like talking about Psycho. Psycho becomes one of the most influential horror films of the 20th century till Texas Chainsaw Massacre gets made, and then until Halloween gets made. But there's an argument to be made for this being one of the most influential, if not the most.
There was a bunch of directors that gave their most influential, Wes Craven, Carpenter, all went back to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Romero even. But you talking about that, Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, you see some of the framework even of those in this film, right? So that's why I don't want to give it that necessarily the most, but it's certainly huge.
Well, it creates and not to play on sequel titles it creates a new generation of horror and a new way of approaching horror. And I think for a lot of the reasons why I think this one becomes so influential and why it's such an important film is because Tobe Hooper was dealing with a lot, obviously personal trauma. I did not know that story until you just told it a few moments ago. I apologize.
I said the 70s. It was actually mid-60s.
Mid-60s.
That happened.
And certainly the larger world themes, which you see, with Romero doing previously with Night of the Living Dead, and you see this as a strong tradition in horror that this happens. But I think it's why it can be situated as something so important is because it deals with those with such a delicate hand. It's there, but you can really just get kind of enraptured in the story that's being told in front of you. It's beautifully shot. I think your "How could you" is appropriate here. How could you not think this is one of the most beautifully shot horror films of all time?
I'm glad you think so. It's not an easy watch for everybody, but it's an important watch for any film, historian or somebody that's a fan of film. It really has its place. When was the first time you ever saw this?
With you.
Was it?
In our apartment in Kutztown.
I thought so.
Yeah.
Okay.
We watched it in the daytime.
I think it's okay. I think this is a movie that can be watched in the day and still have its... that's awesome. That's cool.
Mainly because I think, the first experience I had was a really poor sequel to the film. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have a lot of interest, and I thought it was going to be really gory, and it wasn't. And, this is also, in the time in which, films like Saw and Hostel were coming out. I thought it was going to be like that, and it wasn't,
Oh, yeah,
At all. So I made a lot of assumptions.
You have to know it's not that going in. And I think, and again, you look at the remakes... I literally walked out of the remake. I don't walk out of films very often. We got asked that question doing a panel not long ago, and this was one of the very few that I ever did, was because it just did not have what the original was.
So something we might start introducing, and I know your ire for these sequels, and I know your ire for the remake. Is there a sequel or a remake for this that you think would have made sense? Is there a way to do it?
Well, the more I read about it, I don't think it's going to be. There's another sequel that's coming out that's supposed to be a direct sequel. And that would have been, and I think they're trying to play a little bit off of Halloween 2018, and that's going to be coming out this year on Netflix. The more I read about it, I don't know if they're bringing Sally back. So I have hopes. I will watch it in hope. But... it's hard. I think Tobe Hooper was smart with what he did with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 by just going away and giving it more of that comedic edge. The thing I think I would like to see, if I had seen a sequel, would be something with adults. And I think we always get the trope of kids or young adults, kind of meeting up. Where I think it would be interesting to see something more of same type of style, maybe a little more modern, but more with adults and how they're kind of handling this.
Well, because I think the thing that we do with horror films is what happens to young people. So the adults watching it can go, I'd make different decisions. I'm smarter. Yeah, I'm older. Right. I'm wiser. But it'd be interesting to see something where it's adults who fall into or prey to kind of the same traps.
Yeah, but I'd like to see it in the same way, not these dumb decisions. And I don't think any of these characters make necessarily dumb decisions, and that's what I like about this. And that's what I wouldn't want to see. I don't want to see a bunch of characters that you're supposed to hate and root against. Like, I want to see characters that are making right choices and just falling into some situations they don't understand that turn into horrific circumstances, which sounds really dark to say, but that's what I would want out of a remake.
No, completely. I think
or even a
sequel.
Spiritual sequel even.
Well, and I think that's the thing is like with sequel or remake, and I think this is a conversation you and I have a lot because we don't love sequels and remakes, but I think it's fun to like imagine what they could potentially be, and I like your version of it. That to me makes a lot of sense. I think following Sally in the new version could be smart because if you handle like the trauma aspect of this and then kind of like the history of like what does this do to that town, like what do people think, are there any Sawyers still alive,
right.
You know, I think could be really interesting.
You know who would be really good though in my version, if we did it with some adults? Bill Hader and Ben Schwartz would be really nicely put into that film.
So you want to see the tone from the next generation in your sequel. So if you are not currently following us on social media, please follow us at How Could You Podcast on Instagram, at How Could You Pod on Twitter. You can always email us thoughts and suggestions. We love hearing from you at howcouldyoupodcast@gmail.com. Please follow us on our social media channels to find out latest updates on episodes and our cocktails of the podcast. Hopefully you tried those twin cocktails we made for Fast Times and Days. Got something pretty fun planned for this episode as well, so you can check out all of that on our social media pages.
And until next time, make sure you gas up those vehicles and enjoy the Odyssey.